Welcome everyone. This is Mr. Ashby with looking at APUS history and the Jeffersonian era in Brinkley and Amsco Chapter 7. So let's get started right away. In this lecture, we're going to be really focusing on Jefferson and Madison with a little bit of Monroe. We're basically going from the 1800s, 1801 to be a fact, all the way through the War of 1812 and finishing it off with basically with the end of Madison and then the beginning of James Monroe, which will start in Chapter 8. This time period, America is really switching from a political party from the Federalists into the Democrat Republicans. We see our first major international war, besides the Revolutionary War, of course, but our first as a country. Outside of that war, we're also seeing the start of American industry starting to become more self-sufficient and Burgoyne. So the War of 1812 is going to be a big aspect of sort of jump-starting the market revolution, which we'll talk about also in this chapter. Let's start it right away. First of all, with Jefferson, he was elected as a president in 1800. It was also called the Revolution of 1800 because it was so revolutionary to have a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, from one grouping of people to another. Also, this is sort of signifying a shift that America was going from a Federalist mindset into a more Democratic Republican mindset. Even though America was still very strong on its economic principles of the Hamiltonian ideology of building a commerce-based economy, pretty much. Jefferson, with all his might, really wanted this utopian agrarian America. He's not going to get it. There's just no way that it's going to get more agrarian. He's going to do lots of things with that principle in mind, most notably the Louisiana Purchase, with basically purchasing all that land and then basically using that land to move Native Americans westward so he could open up all this new territory to basically, plant these farmers, these yeoman agrarians across the West. Even with that, though, America was going to be slowly moving more to a commerce, merchant, industrialized society. It's not going to become industrial at this point. It's just starting the wheels of moving that way, which we'll see during the lecture. This famous quote that he has, "But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have been called by different names, brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated and reason left free." So basically he's saying is that we are all Republicans, we're all Federalists. We aren't going to completely dismantle everything that Washington and Adams did. But he's also saying that we need to basically put these political ideologies behind us and move forward as a country. So he was going to dismantle some stuff and make it his own, but he wasn't completely overhaul everything that had Washington and Adams stood for. And you see that he won this election pretty closely. And the big part of it is you see this divide between coastal and northern areas and western and southern areas. And that's going to be a divide. We're going to see political divides throughout our country. This is just our first map. We're going to see this, with New York being this really big swing state. Usually there's one or two or three swing states per election. Early on, it seemed like New York was a big swing state. And as Jefferson is going to expand the country westward, we're going to see more and more of those westward ideologies really focusing on this Democrat-Republican theory of agrarian principles. Also, Jefferson is going to be the first president to spend his whole entire presidency in the Capitol in Washington. Remember, they got that as a compromise for dealing with Hamilton's financial plans. And when he took office, he completely cleaned house. Basically, government patronage. Yes, he's going to keep the principles of federalism sort of intact, but he's going to really sort of flood the government with Republican ideologists. But he's also going to reduce the amount of positions in government as well. So he's going to have that moniker of trying to reduce the size of the government. And you see that he obviously was very popular. He had a lot of support. In those first 4 years, he won easily the election of 1804. with Federalists Pinckney only getting a few states. It's two things. One, it shows you Jefferson's popularity, but it also starts showing you the slow demise of the Federalist Party that will be like basically from Adams through the War of 1812. It's a sort of a slow dwindling demise. When you see Adams leaving and you see Hamilton who died, and the party was sort of fractured, and it was sort of on its death blow before the War of 1812. We'll get to why that War of 1812 really changed the party significantly. And one of Jefferson's really big ideologies was decreasing the size of the federal government. He really wanted a small federal government that was, again, in the principles of the Articles. He tried that. He really tried to cut spending. He cut jobs. He basically tried to cut the armed forces, again, for conceptual reasons and money reasons. Again, he didn't really believe that we should have a standing army because that standing army could directly go against protesters, civilians, and other institutions. He also wanted to cut spending on foreign commerce, too. Because he did that, he was able to abolish that whiskey tax. One of his really big goals was that whiskey tax. He also pushed Congress to overturn the Alien and Sedition Acts. Those two acts that he was really had a lot of animosity about in Adams' term. Okay, early on though, Jefferson's going to be faced with a major decision. And this is going to be this Marbury versus Madison case. Again, it's not going to be a case till 1803, but he makes a decision on what to do in 1801, which will really pave the course of history. What happens is, in 1801, after Adams loses this election, again, in actually 1800, the Federalists are doomed. They know that they are a dying party if they cannot secure some branch of government. The Democrat and Republicans basically won over Congress. They won the White House. The thought is that if those Federalists could basically hold on to that judicial branch, then at least they would have the makings of checking those other two branches in power. So Congress, still Federalist dominated, creates the Judiciary Act of 1801, which creates 22 new lifetime posts. And of course, Adams will fill them with Federalist-minded judges. Okay? So Adams filled those so he wouldn't get too much controversy right before Jefferson takes office. That's why they're called the midnight appointments. Fills them based on the midnight before his term ends. And of course, Jefferson comes in, he gets inaugurated, and then his first duty is to fill these appointments. So he instructs James Madison, Secretary of State, not to deliver the commissions. Don't deliver those 22 commissions. We are not going to fill the judges because he thinks it's unconstitutional. Of course, William Marbury, not getting his judgeship, hates it and sues. And so when this is taken to John Marshall rules in a couple ways. One, he tells Madison, you're wrong. You absolutely violated the Constitution by not delivering the appointments. However, that law, the Judiciary Act of 1801, was created unconstitutionally. Therefore, Madison should never have been put in the place of breaking the law. And the big precedent that's set, which is really important that you guys get, is the precedent of judicial review. That basically the Congress can review an act, the Supreme Court can review an act of Congress and pretty much overturn it. And it allows the Supreme Court to be a powerful branch to check basically the will of the president and the will of the Congress. Very important. Okay, another important thing in the Jeffersonian time period is the advancement of land and basically expanding America. Louisiana was bought for one reason, basically the mouth of the Mississippi River. He wanted New Orleans to secure an outflow for all that commerce and all those agrarians in the basically middle part of America. He wanted that. However, the new owners of this land, the French, didn't want to sell it. They wanted to sell the whole piece, not just New Orleans, but all Louisiana. The problem with that, though, is that Jefferson had no legal rights to buy it. Again, Congress had to give them those rights, and he didn't give them those rights. And so he basically told his ambassador, buy it. $15 million, buy it. He does. He basically buys and doubles the size of America. And this is so important because of a couple of reasons. One, he contradicts himself. I'll go back to the slide in a second. He literally will use loose interpretation and applied powers to buy this land. The same powers that he lambasted and criticized Hamilton for using and overusing for the bank and creation of the bank. So he completely contradicts himself, which we'll see Jefferson does a lot in his term and also just in basically his philosophy in many cases. What's so important about this? That it is all this new land is new land that you can remove natives from the Ohio River Valley and from Georgia and Alabama, and this way to then move them over to this new land, then to open this area up for cultivation and yeoman farmers. So this is really about agrarian principles. He wanted to get this land to make America, again, this area of America, the orange area of America, an agrarian utopian area, full of education and full of land, where basically any American could get land, become an eligible voter, be educated, and be a participant in the civil body politic. That's the real sort of reason he wanted this. And of course, he could have explorers explore this with Lewis and Clark heading westward, trying to find an all-water route to the Pacific. They'll never find one, but they do find lots of natives. And they're instructed on this journey there, in this 2-year journey, to basically make barters and make agreements and trade peace pacts with these natives to be able to utilize them in the future. They also mapped it. Again, they were also in charge of basically mapping it, finding out the flora and the fauna of this area. Luckily, they were able to get some help with Native Americans. This Native American, Sacagawea, actually was a huge help because she went along with them to help navigate, but really what she stood for is showing the other Native tribes that they were not a warring party, that they didn't have to be threatened by a war because there's a female aboard, which again, Native Americans were not going to ever have a female as part of a warring group. Okay, the Burr conspiracy. Albert Burr was the vice president of Jefferson. He was also a lot of other things too. He was not very happy about losing the election of 1800. He and Jefferson were at odds with each other. He knew that his political life was about to die once Jefferson could basically get rid of him from the vice presidency, which again had to wait 4 years, but he was going to. So Burr had this idea that if he could get basically New England and New York to basically secede from the Union, he could possibly become that new president. So he really wanted that, but he had to get New York and New Jersey to make this plan work. This is called the Ex Junto, which was these Federalists from New England were really trying hard to do that. Hamilton was against this, though. Even though he was a diehard Federalist, his party lost election. He was not about to break up the Union for personal political gain. And so he absolutely helped nix this plan, which put Burr in even more of an unfavorable situation politically. Burr also ran for governor, and Hamilton bashed him in the media, and Burr will lose the election, then intentionally through letters blaming blaming Hamilton for his demise. Burr will challenge Hamilton to a duel, and of course he will kill him. There's lots of thoughts that Hamilton actually was not trying to kill Burr. He actually raised his gun, fired at like a tree branch, where Burr obviously killed Hamilton. Eventually, Burr will be banished from politics. He'll flee west and actually try to start a new rebellion in Louisiana, another sort of a secession rebellion. It'll fail, and Burr will go down in history as one of our all-time scapegoats, villains of America. Okay, we're also going to have Indian issues, Native American issues in this time period. There's 2 big areas where we're going to have them. So one big area is that this whole area of North America that was where the former British had forts were still occupied in many cases by British, and then they never left after the Revolutionary War. And what the British did, they were actually paying Native Americans to harass American settlements, paying Native Americans for scalps of Americans. It's basically giving natives guns, weapons, gunpowder to basically harass and make the settlement of the West as hard as possible for the Americans. So that was one thing that was going on. Also, Jefferson was wanting Native Americans to either move west or assimilate, So Jefferson, make sure you write this down, called natives noble savages, the ones that could incorporate themselves as a yeoman farmer, educate themselves, and be Christians. He said, if you can do those three things, incorporate yourselves into American society, you can stay here and be part of our American experiment. Of course, there's going to probably be some discrimination and lack of some rights and voting rights, stuff like that. But again, you can still stay here and be part of our land. If you're not going to do those three things, we're going to remove you west. And he's going to use William Henry Harrison as that main general to push Native Americans westward. Prior to the War of 1812, we're going to see Harrison really rise up to sort of overtake the one big sort of Native American rebellion that was, banding together to try to stop this removal. Tecumseh and his band of tribes have banded together. Harrison will basically raid these villages with just an overpowering of soldiers and basically squash this sort of rising up to Tecumseh and the northern tribes. And again, they eventually removed to the west or Canada. And at this point, because some of these tribes were being influenced by the British, many people started saying, well, maybe we should actually go to war against British Canada. We also had issues with our natives in Florida. Because Florida was actually a Spanish territory. But the thing was, those Native Americans were coming across the border into Georgia, raiding Georgian settlements and running back into Florida for safety. And that was going to be another thing. So basically, Madison annexes northern and western portion of Florida. Tensions increase between the Spanish and the Americans. Eventually, we will have an agreement, a treaty that will deal with that. That'll be in Monroe's presidency. But this also brings America to the brink of another international war with Spain. So we are having all these issues going on internationally wise. At the same time, Europe was in flames with war, with Napoleon Bonaparte basically going to war against Europe, and big time issues going on, especially between France and England. France and England. Okay, international affairs. Some things before we get to the War of 1812. First thing is the Barbary pirates. This was happening in the early 1800s under Jefferson. These Barbary pirates were basically raiding American vessels going into the Mediterranean. They were basically stopping them, harassing them, and then basically asking for tribute, money, bribes. And Jefferson was like, hell with this. Hell with this. These people don't listen. And here's his quote, tribute or war, the usual alternative of these Barbary pirates. Why not build a navy and decide a war? So Jefferson will increase the size of our navy into a standing navy, an all-time navy, and use that navy to help basically protect our merchant vessels going through these waters, which it works. But what he does is contradict himself again, because remember, he was the one who says we shouldn't have any type of standing military, a military that's often operational in non-war times. But he says, we don't have to worry about a navy because a navy can't subdue on-land population. So he justifies it, like why it's okay for him to expand our military, but not for other people. Okay, War of 1812, some conflicts going on prior to the war. So first, we have this war between England and France. Both sides are putting trade restrictions on us. Both sides are harassing our vessels. England especially. The Chesapeake Leopard affair, 1807, that's a big one right there. What happens is basically the SS Leopard, this British vessel, the HSS, basically comes off to America and fires upon our ship, our warship Chesapeake. They stop our ship, they take our soldiers, they confiscate goods, and they basically then fire on the ship. And this sort of starts off this big dilemma. America does not want to go to war. We can't let this happen. So Jefferson enacts this Embargo Act, this crazy harsh act that basically states that basically we have to cut off trade with all other European nations. That basically we're going to stop all U.S. ships from leaving port to other countries until France and England have repealed the restriction on U.S. trade. So we are refusing to trade with basically using our vessels to go across the Atlantic Ocean. which devastates our economy. You see our exports dropped from 108 million in 1806 down to 22 million in 1808. It just devastated the American economy. Yes, it kept American vessels safe, but at the cost of just economic downfall. Okay. And then we see also a new election. So we have this 1808, 1807, and in 1808, we're going to see Madison run for election and win. And you see that he wins it pretty easily over Pinckney. And you see that the rundown of the Democratic-Republican support is very much in the South and the West, where the Federalists are still in New England and coastal areas. And this is now the second leg of this Virginia dynasty. The Virginia dynasty is basically Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. These presidents, they all have 8 years in service, so it's basically 8, 16, 24 years of all Democrat Republicans and all presidents from Virginia. This little mini dynasty, you could call it. Okay. Madison's foreign policy. Immediately, Madison won an election and basically says, you know what, I need to do something immediately about this depression we're in. He's going to pass the Non-Intercourse Act right when he steps in office, which will permit trade with all nations except England and France. So it allows our merchant vessels to start going over to Spain and the Netherlands and Germany and Italy and other places in Europe. But still, our two big trading partners are England and France. So we're still hurt. A year later, Macon's Bill number 2 basically passes Congress that basically says that with economic hardships continuing, Congress restores trade with Britain and France as long as trade restrictions stop from those other two countries. So this basically makes it even easier to trade with countries. And of course, we're going to get into war. Obviously, we have lots of people that are claiming for war. We have the impressment issues. We have Chesapeake incident. We have military assistance to the Northwest and the Native Americans in the West. And we, of course, have a group of Americans, frontiersmen, Southerners, planters, Westerners, that are very much into war. We call these the war hawks, the Calhouns and the Clays, who are clamoring for war, clamoring to basically get back at Britain. Remember, these people are typically have always been against Britain too. Ever since the whole ideology of the Democrat Republicans and the Federalists and who they side, the French or the British. Well, these people were always a little bit anti-British too, and now they have justification. They have the impressment that the British are putting on the soldiers. They're having the British, basically encouraging the Native Americans to harass American soldiers and kill them. And now we have this war. The war was almost a disaster for Americans. Again, it was a stalemate at best. We really did lose this war without actually officially losing this war. Pretty much Britain held advantage of all the most battles. They sacked our capital. They burnt our White House. They really gave it to us pretty good. But we did come out of it well in the end. Okay. For example, here's basically what it is. The Treaty of Ghent, signed by John Quincy, ended the war. So it's a stalemate. It was a 2-year war. We both sort of got in there. Britain could absolutely kept the war going and basically doomed us. They didn't, though. So by stalemating England, it really allowed us to say, hey, we are a country that has to be reckoned with. Okay, you have to take Americans seriously internationally. That's one thing. By doing this also, this is going to basically end the tension between England and America for the most part. We'll still have a little bit, but for the most part, the tensions between England and America are going to recede and get much better. So that's a good thing. That alliance between the two countries is going to slowly bond together and form, which is going to be huge in the 1900s during the World Wars. Most of the fighting was done on the Great Lakes and in the northern parts of Canada and North America. Very little fighting was actually done here in America. Pretty much most of it being within the Chesapeake Bay area and Washington, D.C. Okay, the last battle of the war was actually a battle fought after the war ended in Battle of New Orleans on January 8th, 1815. General Jackson basically basically subdued a much larger British army and became a national hero for defeating the British and really sort of putting a cap on this, allowing the Americans to save face and say, hey, we beat the British back. And it'll catapult Jackson into a political career. Okay, one more slide. This is so important. In the late 1814, right before the treaty was signed to end the war, a group of Federalists met in Hartford, Connecticut to discuss making new constitutional amendments to put in the Constitution to give them more power. And if that wasn't going to be met, they were going to threaten secession. Okay, so this conference happened, and then the war ended. And none of this stuff was put forward, but this was leaked out that they were talking about this during the war of actually seceding. And this was like, wow, people were like, these people are treasonous. The Federalists are out just for themselves and not really for the good of the country. And this was the death blow to them. This is really what killed the Federalist Party to a point where they could not escape from. They will run one more presidential election in 1816 and lose just overwhelmingly against Monroe. And their party will cease to exist the next year. So this is really that nail in the coffin for the Federalist Party. Okay, that is your Chapter 7 lecture. Pretty concise, pretty quick. Those big points of Marlborough versus Madison, Louisiana Purchase, and the War of 1812 are those big three themes in this time period. Okay, till next time, you guys have a great evening and be well.